just get started, you'll see what we're going to talk about. But I want to add to this introduction, not to go over this, but just so you have an idea of where I come from and what the background is. Dave Zwang talked a lot about standardization as need for automation, and that is all I'm going to talk about. And essentially, that is also what the Ghent work group is about and was about from the very start. I have a reasonably long history with graphic arts by now. I used to be a developer at Unfocus. If you know the name Pitstop today, then that was my first product, and I actually wrote the first versions of that. Those of you who still know what Tailor is have been in this industry for a long time. At the moment, I'm CTO at 4Ps. That's an integrator slash distributor of software in Europe and worldwide, actually. So we deal with a lot of these automation and workflow issues that Dave was mentioning as well. A lot of that stuff sounds very, very familiar to me. So what are we going to talk about? I'm going to take you on a bit of history of the Ghent workgroup. That is one. I want to talk about what the Ghent workgroup can offer to you as well, in a little bit more detail than what you see in the previous presentation. And I also want to spend some time on where I think we are today and what the challenges are. And luckily, my conclusions, I think, will resemble the ones from Dave you heard before. But let's start with the beginning. The beginning of this all is PDF. And as most of you should know, PDF was an Adobe format invented by Adobe in around 93, kind of adopted by graphic arts around 96, 97, that started to be the case. But it was not originally, and this is kind of the source of many of the problems we have with PDF today. It's a really great format, but there is still lots of stuff that can go wrong with it. And the source of that is that PDF was not originally invented for use in graphic arts, of course. Adobe needed a format that they could use on the web, that they could use for electronic documentation. They did not have graphic arts in mind. And in fact, it took a number of versions of PDF before there were enough features in there that you could actually use it in graphic arts workflows. So why was it invented? Well, you see all the keywords on here. The only one that is a little bit strange is vendor neutral, because of course it was invented as an Adobe format, and by default, Adobe is a vendor, so by default it was not vendor neutral. But they really wanted it to be a platform that anyone could use, because they were smart enough to see that, of course, that would be very good for the uptake of the format. It had to be universal, it had to be self-sufficient, it had to be compatible. All of that was done or had the goal to make PDF available in as many different locations in workflows and devices and operating systems as possible. At the same time, because they wanted to use this in many different locations, but for example, also on the internet, it had to be compact, which is the reason we still have all kinds of different compression techniques you can use in PDF today. It also had to be well behaved, meaning if I make a PDF file on my system and I send it to one of you, that PDF needs to look exactly the same or there's going to be trouble. So these were kind of the initial goals that existed for PDF, and Adobe kept advancing the format for many years until about 2008. And at that point, they took the intellectual property right that they had for PDF and they gave it away to the International Standards Organization, to ISO. From that point on, PDF became an international standard, ISO 32000, very nice number for an international standard as well. And from that point on, so from 2008 going forward, the development of PDF and new versions of PDF is under control of ISO, no longer under the sole control of Adobe. So now it really is a vendor-neutral format as well. And that is, of course, important because so many other things were built on top of PDF and is reassuring that control of a very essential standard to our industry is not, that control is not held by one big company, but it's held by a much more neutral standards organization. So let's look at where we went from there. We started with PDF, and very early on, and that is something that you'll see come back when I talk about Ghent Group as well. Very early on, people discovered that just sending a PDF file was better than sending someone a Quark Express or an InDesign file, although InDesign at that point in time probably didn't exist yet. But it was much better than sending someone a native file. You had a lot less compatibility issues, but it still was not enough. There were still issues with that. And people started looking at standardization. Now, before I talk too much about PDFX and Ghent Workgroup, I want to share this cartoon with you. It's in 3 parts, and I'll tell you who made it afterwards. But this is very, very typical for standards development. This is what happens all the time. It is why we have 3,000 adapters when we travel for all kinds of things. And so luckily we could avoid this a little bit in what happened with PDFX and Ghent Workgroup. But typically when you have a standard, what happens is someone sees that there is a problem because, like it says here, there are 14 competing standards. And then there usually is someone who is smart and says, oh, if there are 14 competing standards, someone should go through the process of developing a universal standard that covers everything. One ring to rule them all, if you like fantasy. So that would be a very good idea. And of course, it's a very good idea. And it's easy to get people enthusiastic about that. Unfortunately, that story usually ends with the fact that there are then 15 competing standards, because it's not so easy to come up with a standard that actually does cover the use cases of everyone. Yeah? So standard development by itself is a very difficult process. And if you wonder at some point why a standard is complex or why there are multiple versions of a standard or multiple flavors, I would advise you, and it's a little bit sadistic to say so, but I would advise you to try and join one of the ISO meetings at some point, for example, and see how that works, and you'll understand a little bit better what the process is. Now, before I go on, this is the guy that this cartoon comes from. One of the reasons I probably like it is because he's a physicist, which I am as well by training. So the website is unpronounceable, but he writes about technology and science, and very often things that are really, really humoristic, at the same time a little bit sad and true. So check that out. I can vouch for him. So let's go back to PDFX. Where does this come from? Well, it comes from the realization, like I said, that PDF by itself is not enough for what we need in graphic arts. And the origin of PDFX lies in mostly in the US. There was an organization there called DDAP, Digital Distribution of Advertising for Publishing. So this was an organization for people who dealt with the creation of ads in magazine and in newspapers and so on, and the distribution of those. So the exchange between whoever made them and whoever had to publish them in a newspaper or a magazine. They developed something that was called PDFX1, and that was eventually picked up by the ISO standards organization, and it became an ISO standard in 2001. And the ISO standard wasn't called PDFX1. It turned out, like I said, standards development is complex. It turned out that the version that everyone started using was called PDFX1A. So that is where that comes from. The X comes from blind exchange, which is a little bit strange, but there you go. And the idea behind blind exchange was that if I am a developer of an ad, a creator of an ad, I should say, I guess, if I create an ad and I save it as a PDFX file, I should be able to throw it over the wall to a printer, not talk to that printer, and that printer should be able to print it, and it should look exactly the same as what I had in mind when I designed it. Now, there's a lot of ifs in that story, but that was the basic idea. Blind exchange means that you don't need communication between the different parties in the workflow, and the right thing still comes out. That was the whole concept. It's important to realize that because if you look at the restrictions that you have in PDFX, all of those restrictions come from that basic paradigm. It's all about reducing chances that something might go wrong, that there would be a miscommunication. Okay, so what is important, and this is a picture that will come back in a little while again. If you've ever seen these are the little typically wooden dolls where one fits into the other. This standard story that I'm telling is a little bit like that. At the top, you have a PDF, which, as we know, is an ISO standard by itself. And then you have the ISO committee that says, okay, let's make a standard for graphic arts, and we'll call it PDFX. And that becomes a subset of a PDF. Yeah. So every PDFX file is a PDF file. Not every PDF file is necessarily a PDFX file. That's how you need to look at this. And we'll add to these levels a little bit as we go along. I already said that standard development was a complex thing. So when you think about PDFX, you should also know, and you probably know, that there are different flavors of that standard. And you see most of them, I think, lined up there. Now, you don't have to remember all of those. The ones that I think you should take note of are the ones that are highlighted here in color. The orange ones, PDFX1A and PDFX4, because those are the two that are used the most today, even though Dave Zwang said, and I agree with him, that PDFX1A should get a red light, and you should actually use PDFX4 if you have the option to do so. Those are still the two that are used the most today. And then the other two in purple, you have to remember for a different reason. PDFX5N, I always single out because it is a version of PDFX that knows how to deal to some extent with multi-channel work or more multi-color workflows or multi-channel, however the term you want to use for that. But so if you have a workflow that does CMYK plus red or CMYK plus some other spot colors, then that is a version of PDFX that was designed for that. And of course, PDFX6 you should remember because that is the upcoming PDFX version built on PDF 2.0. So that is where all of us at some point are going to evolve to. So when you have to remember those, and when we look at the ones that are used today, what is the difference? Well, PDFX1A is, and you should really be aware of this, it's a very old standard. Yeah, PDFX1A goes back to 2001, which by now is almost 20 years, and it's still very much used in graphic arts workflows in general. It is based on PDF 1.4, To put that in perspective, PDF 1.4 was the version of PDF that Adobe developed for Acrobat 5. It's easy to figure that out. You can just add the numbers for the PDF version, and that gives you the Acrobat version. That's how it worked for a long time. So PDF 1.4 went together with Acrobat 5. It was released together with Acrobat 5, and that is a long time ago. The fact that it is so long ago means that it has no support for most of the modern stuff that you can do today in PDF. And that includes, for example, transparency. You cannot have live transparency in a PDF X1A file. That means that a file that comes out of InDesign or Quark Express or Word or anything else today that will generate transparency has to be flattened. Yeah? But you can also not support layers. You cannot have a JPEG 2000. There is a whole list of modern features that you are not allowed to use when you use PDFX1A. In terms of color spaces, it was also very limited. You can have gray and CMYK, that's kind of obvious, and you can have spot color, and that's it. Any other color space is not allowed. So no RGB, no LAV colors, nothing that is based on ICC profiles in the content itself. All of that is forbidden. Yeah? That does not mean necessarily that PDFX1A is not color managed. It still is. A PDFX1A file has an output intent, and that output intent normally contains an ICC profile, and the ICC profile characterizes the color you have in the file. So it is a color managed format if you want, but it's limited to CMYK and spot color. The successor format, PDFX4, is a little bit more modern, a little bit. Go back to here and you see PDF 1.4, go back to PDFX4 and we see PDF 1.6. Again, this was released with Acrobat 7. That is maybe not as old as Acrobat 5, but it's still a long time ago. However, as a format, it was modern enough to allow transparency and layers and JPEG 2000 and some other modern things. And in the design of PDFX4, they also agreed to allow a number of color-managed color spaces. And you see a list there. Of course, the most important ones are the RGB and CMYK ICC-based color spaces. So a little bit of a more modern format, and especially the fact that this allows for live transparency means that it will behave much better in modern workflows as long as the RIP that you have at the end of the workflow and the applications that you use in the middle of the workflow know how to deal with such files. And that for a long time stopped the adoption of PDFX4 because we simply did not have enough RIP versions that were being used by people that were compatible with files having live transparency and having color managed images and so on in them. In case you thought that PDFX was the only standard from ISO that is based on PDF, then I have to disappoint you. Here is a list of other standards. And usually when I do training, I ask people to tell me what the lie is on this slide, because not all of these things are actually ISO standards. In fact, PDFH is standard related to medical use of PDF, and it is not an ISO standard. Everything else that you see here is an ISO standard at the moment. So we already talked about PDFX for graphic arts in general. You have PDFA for archival, UA for universal accessibility. So these are PDFs that are suitable for screen reading devices and those types of workflows. PDFE is engineering, PDFs using 3D drawings and stuff like that. VT is variable data and transactional, so optimized for transactional printing workflows. And VCR is a very recent standard that also has to do with variable data. So this is where PDFX by itself comes from. So going back to about 2001, originated largely in the US in a different organization, and then segued into the ISO, where it becomes an international standard. At about the same time, there was a development on the other side of the world as well, closer to where most of you on this call are, and where I am. I, at the time, worked for Enfocus, a Belgian company. So what I have highlighted there is Belgium. And what we saw at that time is that we got questions from industry associations who dealt with commercial print and advertisements. That sounds very similar to what I just told you about in the US. It was that same market segment where we saw the first adoption of PDF and where the first questions around standardization started to happen. So these people came to us and said, well, we are seeing more and more PDFs being used, but we also see problems. So can we come up with a standard pre-flight profile that would allow us to tell people what kind of PDF they should generate? And we started working with them. And then a little bit later, I say February here, my memory is not good enough to remember exactly when it was, but a little bit later, we got the same question from industry associations in the Netherlands. And a little bit later, we got someone from France who came up to us and said essentially the same thing. And what we realized, of course, was that this was something that was wider than these three countries. And we started bringing people together, and that around June 2002 led to the founding of what became the Ghent PDF workgroup. The PDF has been removed from the name since then because we have a number of initiatives that are wider than PDF since then, but that became the Ghent workgroup. Yeah? And originally it had user associations or representatives from user associations, largely from the countries that you see there. And you can ignore my lack of geography knowledge because I'm missing some bits and pieces. But this is largely where this effort started. The mission statement that we had then is, well, still valid today. Yeah? And that was to establish and disseminate process specifications for best practices in graphic arts workflows. And that points to really two big goals, and that is still, like I said, what we do today. Establishing process specifications, so establishing standards by lack of a better word. We didn't want to call it standards because we were not and still are not an accredited international standards organization. But the first pillar of the Ghent group is to develop these best practices, specifications, standards, whatever word you prefer. And we have subcommittees at the Ghent group who deal with that, who take a particular subject and then do a bunch of work around that and try to come up with a specification. The second part, and very often the most difficult part for the Ghent group, is to disseminate that, meaning how do you take that stuff that we develop and explain to other people that it exists, that it is good, that they should use it, what they should use it for. So that is basically education. And this educational drive that was in there from the very beginning is also a very big challenge, because you have to take very technical content and you have to explain to people why this will improve their life. And with their life, we mean their workflow, what they do in their businesses, how things connect better, how they can connect with customers, how all of that can go better if they follow these specifications, if they adopt that standardized format. So that was the mission statement. And throughout the story, I've said, well, we have this development of PDFX mostly from the US, but then also in, for example, the German-speaking part of Europe adopted PDFX much earlier than some of the other countries. We have that PDFX development on the other hand, on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have the development of the Ghent work group. And the question becomes, of course, who of the two wins? And at a certain point, it really started looking like it was going to be a question of having two standards and competing again for market share. And that would not have been a good idea. The reason I think that was avoided largely is because there are huge differences between ISO as an organization and Ghent Workgroup, and between the goal of ISO with PDFX and the goal of the Ghent Workgroup with its specifications. What you see on the left is characterizes the Ghent Workgroup. What you see on the right characterizes ISO. Yeah? When I say slower on the side of ISO, that is by no means meant to be negative. Although if you sit in a meeting where they discuss having a comma or not in a sentence for half an hour, it can feel very, very slow. Slower also means that generally what comes out is more accurate. It is a little bit more theoretical, often much more theoretical than what happened especially in the beginning at the Ghent Workgroup. The Ghent Workgroup was focused on having something quick. And that also meant that, and that was a very important guideline, whatever the Ghent Workgroup developed had to be usable immediately. And that is still something that you see today. ISO is working on PDF 2.0, PDF X6, and that is something where you'll probably practically see that being used in companies 2 years, 3 years, 5 years from now. It is much more future-oriented, where the Ghent Workgroup says, okay, so we have questions for a specification for digital print, as an example. What can we make that when we release it, it is immediately usable by people? And by definition, that would mean we're not going to build it on PDFX6 because we don't have that yet. It is only going to be available years down the line. So the goals of these two organizations in that sense were very, very different. The other big difference, and that's the last line in here, is that what ISO wanted to do with PDFX was to develop a global graphic arts standard. Maybe there are different flavors of the standard, but PDFX is a standard for the complete graphic arts industry. What the Ghent Workgroup said from the very beginning is, we're not sure we like that. We think that the PDF that is being used in an advertisement for a newspaper, that is probably going to look very different than a PDF that you want to use for a glossy magazine. So the Ghent Workgroup from the very beginning started working on specifications for specific market segments. And because of these differences that you see here, we were able to do this. And this is still a very good representation of what the standards look like in graphic arts today and how they can be implemented and should be used. This is, by the way, the exact same type of slide or image that you saw in Dave Zwang's presentation, where he had this as a pyramid. At the base of the pyramid would be PDF, the overall ISO standard. And then for graphic arts, you would say, well, if we're in graphic arts, we want you to use PDFX. what the Ghent work group says is, well, if you are in commercial print and you're doing glossy work, then you should really use the specification sheet fed offset, high resolution, one of those variants that is created there. And as a company in that market segment, you could say, well, I'm going to adopt that Ghent work group specification, but I'm going to add a number of restrictions of my own. Yeah? So each of those builds on the next. And this is exactly what happened with standard development. The Ghent work group decided at some point that it would base all of its specifications on the PDFX standard from ISO. Yeah? So whenever today you're creating a Ghent work file, you should know that file is also ISO compliant. It's PDFX compliant. So what is really the difference? Well, if you look at PDFX, because PDFX is a global graphic arts standard, there is a bunch of stuff that it cannot check for. Why? Well, I already gave you a reasonably good example with this, this advertisement and the glossy magazine. Let's make it a little bit more extreme. If I print a photo book and one of these items, the second item actually is low resolution. Yeah, when I print a high quality photo book, then I might require 300 dpi, maybe even more, as resolution for the images in that book. If I'm in sign and display, and I know that I am printing a billboard that is going to be at the side of a highway, then the resolution that you work with for those types of print is maybe 32 dpi or even lower. Yeah? So you go from 300 dpi or higher for glossy work in one market segment to 30 dpi or lower in another market segment. And both of those are part of graphic arts. So if you think of PDFX as a generic standard for graphic arts, it cannot possibly say anything about image resolution. And the same for things like hairlines or what is supposed to be rich black or ink coverage. All of those things you cannot have in a global standard for graphic arts because it is too diverse. The Ghent work group, however, can have specifications for that or requirements for that because it makes these different variants for different market segments. And if I know that I'm working for sign and display, then I can take that into account in the rules that I set. Yeah? So this gives you an idea of why both concepts are valid and why you can build one on top of the other. Variance means there is one PDFX 1A standard, and like I said, there are many different Ghent work group variants. And we started with about 9. It grew to a little bit bigger over time. Then we threw some of them away because they weren't used very much. This is a dynamic thing. If there are new market segments that appear or new technologies that appear that have their own requirements, then the Ghent work group's work is, or job is to come up with specifications for those. So the number of variants and what exactly they aim at is something that lives a little bit over time. So let's take a look at what we have developed and what you still see in use today and what you should be looking at. This is very similar than the story I've already told for PDFX, so it will not become very difficult. One of the specifications from the Ghent work group is called 1v4, and you don't ask me where the name comes from. It should be fairly obvious by now that anyone involved with standards development has no idea about what good marketing names are. So it is called 1v4, and it is a Ghent work group specification that is relatively old by now, and that is built on top of PDFX 1A. So all the things that were true for PDFX 1A, meaning no transparency or layers or only CMYK and SPA, color and no other color spaces. All of those things are also true for this Ghent group specification. Now, when I first made this slide probably 5 years ago, this was by far the most used version of the specification in the world. It might still be, although I think we're getting closer to it being only 50%. And the other 50% is not this 2012. I have included this as for the sake of completeness, but you can now erase this from your brain. What you should remember is 2015. So this is a version of the specification that is actually called 2015. You can imagine why, because it was released luckily just in 2015. This is a version of the specification that is built on top of PDFX4. So here you can have a little bit more modern features, and it is something that by now I think we're starting to see real adoption throughout the countries where Ghent group is known and used. I won't say more about the history, just know that this was a very lengthy process, and that that going from 1v4 to 2015, or if you say that in ISO standards, going from PDFX1A to PDFX4 is a process that for many people was not an easy one, because it had to be, we needed to have significant support from applications and RIPs and so on. So let's talk about what you can get from the Ghent group. And Dave had a slide about this, but I want to go in a little bit more detail because I think it's important. And the first thing you should know is that the website is gwg.org. If you go there, you will essentially see this. Yeah. It is now organized by, at least when you come to the site, by market segment. So you have your own corner if you're in packaging, if you're in digital print, if you're in sign and display, or LFP, if you want to call it that, or if you are in commercial print. Where we come from as an organization very much is commercial print. Yeah, that's where all the initial work from the Ghent group was. And the reason for that is very simple. That's where the adoption for PDF started. So that's where the original demand came from. But since then, we have done a lot of work in other market segments. And if you want to do something and it falls in one of those 4 market segments, then I would very much advise you to go to the Ghent group website and click on that landing page, and you'll get a lot of content that is tailored for that particular market segment. What kind of content? Well, maybe first in the list should be white papers. I know people will read less and less, and I will give you an answer if you don't like reading in a second as well. But there is still very good documentation on the Ghent group website. Yeah. There is too much for me to mention all of them here. I've included some of the ones that I know are the most popular by people who visit the site. And that, but there's a lot more on the website, so I would advise you to have a look around. If you don't like reading, and I can only convince you to download and look at one document, I would very, very strongly advise you to download PDFX Workflow Guide, because that is a really cool document that tries to explain things in as non-technical terms as possible, and talks about PDFX, what you should do, what the different versions are that you have, and what the implication for that is in your workflow. It very practically talks about how to set up documents in applications, even using Quark Express and InDesign as example applications, and what the choices are that were made by ISO and by the Ghent group, and what the effect of those choices is on your workflow. So that's the one I would single out as, if I can only convince you to read one, but I really think you should look at others if they come close to what you're dealing with as well. Okay, so you don't like to read, well, then we also have webinar recordings. One of the things that Ghent Work Group has started doing a little bit more is in an effort to reach people and remember that second pillar of what our mission statement is we've been doing more webinars, and all of those are recorded, and you can see a list here. There was just a Q&A webinar, and next week or the week after, I forget the exact date, there is another one on 10 things you should not do with PDF, but you are probably doing, and why you should not do them and what the alternative is. So these webinar recordings are very often they have similar content to what you find in the white papers, but in this case it is video. So look at those as well. And all of this is free, of course, on the website. Just go there and download the white papers or find the links. I think the webinars are stored on YouTube, so you can see all of them there. The third major thing that I want to highlight is application settings. This is especially useful when you have people who just want to use things. I don't want to read about the theory. I just want to know what to do. Well, for a number of applications, what you see here is a PDF toolbox from Callas. From a number of applications, you have settings. And you'll find them for the Callas technology, you'll find them for Focus technology, you'll find them for Adobe, for Quark Express, or a number of others. And these are application settings like PDF creation settings or transparency settings or pre-flight profiles that you can just download and start using. Now, for some of these settings, and Callas is actually an example, if you download them, the only thing you will get is a PDF file that says you don't need me because the settings are already in the application itself. And that, of course, is what Ghent Work Group tries to push as the ultimate goal. The easiest thing for people is that they don't even have to hear about the Ghent Work Group at all. They just need to use settings that already are in the applications that they use. That's not an easy goal for us because some vendors, graphic arts maybe is only a small part of their business, or it's a big company and it's hard to get hold of the right people and push them until they do what we think is the right thing. But we try to convince vendors to already include those things in their applications. But so this is the application settings page where you can download all of that. And at the top there in orange, well, halfway on the screen here, in orange, you see the different versions like the 2015 and the 1v4 specifications. And we singled out some of the stuff that we've done for other market segments to make it easier, like digital cut sheets and sign and display. The fourth thing that you should know is, and again, this is free, and I would very much encourage you to look at it, is the Ghent Output Suite. Dave mentioned it. This is a test suite. So basically, you get small PDF files, and you see one of them here open in preview. Small PDF files that immediately tell you whether a RIP or an application will process a file or shows a PDF file correctly. Preview does not handle overprint well. And you can see that here because some of these small color patches have large X's in them. And that means that this application is not capable of handling correctly PDF files that contain CMYK on CMYK overprint. Yeah. Now, we already knew that about preview, so we don't really need to see proof of it. But where this is most useful is, for example, you have a workflow or you have an output device. Well, you can print this output suite. There are instructions when you download it on how to do that. You can print that, and when you print it on a device that is compliant, then you should not see any X's anywhere on the Ghent output suite. If you do, it either means that your device is not compliant and it doesn't support some functionality, or, and this is very, very common, that it is not correctly configured. And the second part of this Ghent output suite is that on the Ghent Workgroup website, you also find instructions from vendors who are compliant with the output suite. So vendors can ask us to check that they are compliant, and as part of that process, they need to prove to us that their RIP, for example, can output the test suite without any errors, but they also need to give us instructions that you can follow, which settings to set how, maybe control files that you need, or anything that you need to do in order to output this test suite without any visible errors. So that is one of the sections on there. Go check that out. You can download it again for free and use it in your own work. And then the last, and I want to mention this because, of course, I'm a little bit on this more technical side myself. And I know that part of the people that we have on the Ghent Workgroup website are more from the development side, is technical specifications. Yeah? If you're not a developer, normally you should not download this or look at this. If you want to know the technical detail of what we're working on, those things are there as well. So I think 3 or 4 more slides and then we're done here. I wanted to end this by also looking a little bit at the challenges of the Ghent Workgroup and where we think the remainder of the work is. And I will give you the politically correct answer first, and then I will give you a slightly less politically correct answer second, but still a very easy one. And then I will end with what I think is the real problem, which Dave also already touched upon, and I think is important enough to end with. So the politically correct answer is that the Ghent Workgroup doesn't have specifications for all market segments. And that was especially true a couple of years ago, but in the meantime, there are already specifications for packaging. We have specifications now for sign and display, and we have specifications for digital print. So this is very politically correct. This is a challenge, but we've solved it. Everyone happy. So let's move on, because this is not really interesting. This is more interesting. These are the areas of the world where we see the most representation or use of the Ghent Workgroup. And this is, again, my geography is not really excellent. So think about this as, let's call it Western and Middle Europe and North America. There is a lot of the globe that is not covered, and some of the places that are not covered here are really big economies. And this is a problem. If you talk about standardization and you see that a lot of the work goes to, or more of the work is done, for example, in China, I'll just use that as an example, that more of the printing done in China, then you would want a standard like this to also be represented in that market. And for the Ghent Workgroup, that is a challenge because those countries are far away. There is a language barrier in many cases. And so it is difficult for us to really spread the word to all of those things. This looks worse than it is. In reality, when I go to countries that are not colored in orange here, we already see in many countries that people are using Ghent Workgroup specifications. They might not know about it, but they might use what is built into applications and use them in that way without knowing. And there are always people who know about the efforts of the Ghent Workgroup, who know about PDFX as well, and are using these things. But the concentration certainly is in the orange part of the world here. And it would be nice if that would spread out a little bit more. Okay, let's end with the real problem. And I think I will use my own country to illustrate this. It's always nice to make fun of your own instead of someone else. This is Belgium. The orange part at the top is Flanders, where I come from, Dutch speaking. The more purple part at the bottom is the Walloon area, which is French speaking. And this strange purple blob somewhere in Flanders is Brussels, and we will not speak about that at all. The difference here, and the reason I want to use this, is we're talking about one country. And if you would do an experiment and you would look at the national television station in Flanders, we have such a thing. It's funded by the government, as in most countries, I think, at least in Europe. So there is one for Flanders, one for the Walloon area. It's already strange that there are two such organizations. But if you would look at those for a week in Flanders and a week in the other part of the country, and you would look at the people that appear and the music that is played and the shows that are shown, then it is completely different. Even though we are one country, there are two separate languages, but much more importantly, there are two separate cultures. Are there things in common? Yes, of course there are. When there is a World Cup in soccer, then all of a sudden we are much more one country than at other times. So there are definitely things that unite us, but there is a surprising difference between these two parts of what is supposed to be one country. Now, I want to take that analogy and use it on graphic arts. What you see on this slide is on the left-hand side, someone who is in production, and on the right-hand side, someone who is more on the producing side, creative side. And what we notice over and over again is that there is a very big functional divide between those people as well. About 10 years ago, for a product I was working on, I interviewed, I think, 10 or 15 creative people, and I asked a whole bunch of questions. And one of the questions I asked, I still remember, I asked them, where do you get your information? When you think about your job, the work that you do, what are the websites that you go to get information? And at the end, I ended up with a long list of websites that these people gave me, and I looked at them, and I knew maybe 5% of those sites that they mentioned. So even though I was working in the same field, graphic arts, and this is something that we see on many different levels, there is a very big difference between call it production and call it creative. Yeah. For the Ghent Work Group, it is a challenge to reach people that are on the production side, but it is a challenge that over time we've become better at. It is really, really difficult to do that marketing outreach, or educational outreach to people who are not on the production side, but who are on the creative side. This is a slide, and I will end with this one. This is a slide that comes from a survey that the Ghent Work Group did. I think this was about 2018, I want to say, but I'm not sure of the date, but it's recent enough to be valid. Yeah. And the question was, how many of the files that you receive contain errors, specifically about PDF files? And okay, so you have very sad people here who say all of the files are wrong that we get. I think that is an issue that is bigger than what the Ghent Work Group can solve. But you see that the fraction of people that say that they get between 10 and 50% of files that have errors, or between 50 and 90%, that's a very big fraction. And if you look at the same survey from 10 years earlier or 20 years earlier, then you'll see that the situation has become a little bit better, but it's still nowhere where it should be. And if we want to improve this, what you need to do is you need to be able to explain not only to people in production what we need to do around standardization and so on, but we also need to be able to explain that to the people who are on the creative side, because they, in many cases, are the ones who make the files. And don't understand me incorrectly. I'm not blaming creatives for making wrong files. What I'm saying is that their world is different, their goals are different, and it is in part job of the people on the production side to make sure that what we tell creative people is well, correct, easy to understand, easy to implement and use, because otherwise we're never going to get to a better picture than this. There we go. That was what I wanted to share. You can see there a slide that, well, on the one hand, you have my email address. If you want to reach out, I will be happy to answer. But you also have an email address for the Ghent work group. If you want to participate, we would welcome that. We always do. Just send an email to either this admin address or to me or to both. And we will be very happy to tell you how you could participate and what the opportunities are. Thank you very much.